one of the vents on this southwest. So the ridge goes down and then breaks into two. So this is the Southwest Indian Ridge. And, this is the news article was about all these unbelievably cool and brand new species that were discovered. And the whole idea that life could even be, huge ecologies could exist at that level was only discovered in 1977. So it's really not that long ago. Might seem long ago to some of the rest of you, but it doesn't feel that long ago to me, talking about where and when I was born. This is the scaly-footed snail and the yeti crab. And I wanted to look at, I've just got an image quite randomly here from Dylan McGarry, who's part of the One Ocean Hub, who was inspired by stories from a similar part of the coast about ancestral lineages that are based at the bottom of the sea too. So how do these two things intersect? The yeti crab that is on the sea floor, and also previous ways of thinking about what lies at the bottom of the sea. And not just in kind of folk tales and stories, but also there's quite a few novels at the moment. I'll just put 2 examples up to show you that there are novels that deal with this. I know it seems quite random potentially, but there are quite a few texts that are thinking about this relationship between land and sea, particularly in the way, there's lots and lots of literature about the relationship between land and sea horizontally. So where cultures meet on the beach. But there's a few more now about the relationship between kind of the sea and what's above the sea. So that sort of thought about vertically at the sea surface. And the way I'm trying to make the book really about the submarine is by using this construct of science, which divides the sea into zones vertically. So obviously we divide the sea into zones horizontally, like the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, that's kind of across its surface. It's also divided into zones vertically, and they have scientific names and also these incredibly poetic names, like the sunlight zone, the twilight zone, the midnight zone, the abyss, and the trenches. Each of the kind of what I was hoping to do is to force myself to really engage with the full three-dimensionality of the sea by making each of the book's chapters about one of these levels. It has since come to my attention that these divisions are very controversial, even among scientists. There are different ways of breaking the sea up into horizontal, into vertical layers. But I think that's kind of part of the book, is that it's going to be, there are actually many ways of thinking about this in science. And then there are also other ways of thinking about it in indigenous knowledge systems, in creative work, in art and music and film. So I kind of want to embrace the multiplicity rather than, and the sort of oddly poetic nature of the breakdown. Cool. So this is kind of the idea. So Hester Blum is one of the people working on ocean studies, and she, quite a while ago now, asked this question: if our perspectives had been repositioned in recent decades to consider history from the bottom up, or the colonizer as seen by the colonized, then what would happen if we take the ocean's non-human scale and depth as the first critical position and principle? And so this is kind of what I'm thinking about in the answer is, okay, if I'm writing a book about the deep sea, why then the Indian Ocean? So I've sort of been giving you why the deep sea, and now I'm going to say why the Indian Ocean, and that's partly because I want to do, she says, well, we can turn from this bottom-up perspective, which is a kind of subaltern post-colonial view, and I want to and turn to also taking this kind of the non-human, multi-species view. But what I'm challenging myself to do in the book is to think about both of those at once. So the deep sea from a sea which is surrounded by poorer countries than the other oceans, and is part of the, what we call the global south. Hester is the person who says, we need in our humanities work to embrace the things that we do well, which is to understand the sea as a metaphor and how that works. And we also need to know that the sea is not a metaphor only. You know, it's not just a metaphor for fluidity. It has its own like chemistry and characteristics that also need to be appreciated, and vulnerabilities need to be appreciated. So that means in the end, trying to bring these different discourses together. So, you know, this is an example of things I currently have on my desk. And one is a book about the Hadal Zone by the marine biologist Alan Jameson, a personal hero. And then theorizing the sea. So this is scholar Melody Jew from media studies, who has talked about using diving as a humanities method. And then novels like Black Mamba Boy, which is on my desk to read, which has scenes of pearl diving as an indigenous practice of submarine extraction. And I have a whole section now on pearl diving. Okay, 3 final points and done. And that's this question, you know, maybe just to raise for the group. So questions of literacy come up when you're talking about these relationships. So these are where you find yourself humble, that I'm not literate in this scientific discourse, so I'm having to become literate. And just as much, actually, when you're in conversation with someone who's trying to make their work accessible, a scientist trying to make their work accessible, they also feel quite not literate in popular culture, for instance. Numeracy is a big part of that. So I think there is a knee-jerk terror of numbers in people who have ended up studying humanities. And I think that's something we need to like sort of think about a little bit more deeply as a discipline. How do we deal with that kind of inevitable numbers involved in understanding? It's like a different language involved in understanding scientific work. And then to end with this, that if there is a relationship between science and humanities, or within these micro versions, or a way of communicating science, I'm interested in the extent to which it's made, in my experience, most operational. The ways in which it's actually worked is through relationships and friendships and intellectual collaboration. So us doing oceanography at Mahita's house, and the, you know, author of the Africa chapter is someone I met at university, and we just talked about the IPCC report and how I could understand it on hikes, whether or not, and this both sounds a bit sentimental and possibly silly, but I think there's quite a lot of emerging methodological scholarship on the importance of relationality to interdisciplinary work. And I think UBC in Vancouver is a real center of this. So I know Astrida Neymanis is working on it, and Alistair Punga Somerville, who's a Pacific thinker. Okay, that was a lot. And I think maybe we'll be a bit baffled, but let's feel free to just tell me about your experiences of science humanities or science communication work and its challenges in particular. Yeah, thanks for listening.
So much. Yeah, there was so much that was surfaced and raised, and it's really interesting to listen to somebody make so kind of 2 directions, 2 oceans meeting, kind of like we have shoreline, where it's a bit tumultuous and we're figuring it out, and people are casting their nets in, and or, you know, not going in themselves and feeling with their bodies, and all these different ways of trying to understand this very rich mixing space, which is both very material and scientific and full of data, and also very experienced and affective and speculative. And, you know, how do we kind of make sense of that and communicate that, come into a closer understanding, relationship, kind of just having a sense of this huge unknown that's really pushed outside of and has been made by a large degree sort of pushed into amnesia out of memory. That's also many people did always know and still do know, you know. So all of these things coming together it's really interesting to think about that as communication and science communication. And so just to really kind of bring that back out into like an openness that that everyone who's over here who's working within this sort of terrain would be able to kind of fit in and move through, you know, which I think speaks to your interesting point at the end about relationality and doing academic work and moving together across disciplines. I mean, I can't imagine the ocean as anything but transdisciplinary. So please feel free to ask any questions. I have so many, but this is really a session for everyone here. Anything that comes up, questions about methods or ways of thinking or anything specific or how it just resonates with something that you're busy with, would be really wonderful to have service.
How do you go about approaching scientific topics from a humanities background? So doing something with or approaching these topics with no prior knowledge, and they're quite complex things. So how do you go about it? Sort of just jump straight in, or you kind of start?
Yeah, you can also tell me the ways I have done it, whether the best way to do it, I'm not sure. But I mean, I do think two things. One is with considerable humility, you know, that often it's very unclear. We can be quite confident the less we know about something, then you don't know how much you don't know. So one of the things to do is to say, okay, well, maybe I do need to read the kids' book first, and then the the high school textbook, and then the undergraduate textbook, you know, to get a sense of what's out there. And that's fine, you know, actually just with humility, go as far back as we need to go. Like, okay, I didn't do biology in school. Turns out when you're doing interdisciplinary work, you think, damn, why didn't I do biology in high school? And how can I update my work? So, I mean, that's one thing, like to start as low as you need to, I think. And the other thing is that the other way in which to, you know, I guess to approach with humility in this respect is that one thing we're less used to, and certainly in kind of arts and humanities disciplines, less so in history, but is the danger of just saying stuff that's empirically false. And you're much more likely to do that when you're doing this kind of interdisciplinary work. So that confidence rating for yourself internally is to be like, actually, do I know this for sure? And if not, I'm not going to put in brackets, I'm saying this with high confidence, but I am going to couch it in my narrative, to figure out ways to convey where you're not sure and not to just kind of speak out of turn. But I'm a huge fan of finding, you know, not imagining that you're going to spend all your evenings now doing oceanography courses when you have to make it really fun for yourself. Otherwise, you're never going to do it. But you know, there's fantastic MOOC courses online. Southampton has a bunch. So going back to coursework, I mean, that's probably not very exciting to those of you currently doing coursework, but it's you know, reading the news articles about stuff that's happening in science is another way of trying to keep up with things. No.
Yeah. So someone else behind me. I don't see anyone. No, but please go for it. There's something.
Something that all program as such, that we then do is now, push back and have to listen to the rest. Read a lot. I'm reaching what's needs to more from it. He was that chance with the
Yeah, that was yeah. What Ria is referring to is this. There was the international body on Antarctic Research had a pandemic project, and so it's just a question of what can we contribute. And I've worked with some colleagues to coordinate a project on what's happening with Antarctic tourism during the pandemic, ship workers. So that's coordinating role, which really we all learn on the fly. And then we had both noticed, a colleague of mine in literature and I had noticed that there's lots of references to just how clean the polar regions are, clean and cold and fresh. And so we did a little paper on the use of Antarctica as an analogy for non-viral infection, non-infection. So it's finding the thing that you've noticed that does link, and can be a part of it. Yeah.
So my question is something that I've been thinking about ever since I took this job in science communication. Also having no background really in science, any kind of science, and that I think is a literary and quite well positioned to maybe shed some light on. It's like humanities, communication, just media, narrative, expertise that we bring to like these interdisciplinary projects. Like, are we always, I don't want to say doomed. Doomed is not the right. Are we always be resigned to like dealing with knowledge at the level of like analogy and metaphor? And it just feels like, I don't know, I feel like the scientists see what they do as like, data. And then what we bring is like the humanistic, the translated, the interpretive, and I'm just like, is that our role? Or that I'm asking? I'm like, I guess what I'm asking is that role equal to the science that the scientist?
Yeah.
What is equal?
Yeah.
What does equal look like? Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've been I wanted to bring stats in this, but I'm terrible at finding and understanding stats, obviously. But as anecdotes about this, that like just the sheer size of how many of us there are versus how many scientific people working in scientific disciplines there are. I think ours, we can't see ourselves as numerically. We're not going to be numerically. That's just a very micro discipline in terms of research, in terms of obviously how much funding is required for our research and how much is spent on as well. And in fact, the vast majority of even scientific research, like over 90% in the US, for instance, is medical research. And then science is a very small bit, and then humanities is like with a microscope. So there's something about, okay, we don't have numerical parity. And we don't have the kind of heft of data. But at the same time, the language we work in is the language, I think, in which most human brains think. And so that's the kind of level of where we might have parity, the way in which we speak. And I think we should aim to speak more like this, is roughly understandable by most people. And that's, I think, a massive, we're actually, that's an immense power, that this kind of studying the deep trends and historicizing the trends within culture and within the language that we use to speak about things that is also everyday speech. So, but what I hoped, I think, to show you in the talk is that it's not necessarily a subservient role in the humanities. That's the only thing. And when it is, it gets quite dicey. Yeah, gets quite, and it doesn't work actually. If all you're doing is, okay, you're basically getting coffee for the scientists that are, I mean, and there is a sense of that. But I think that the relationship is possible if we both understand the scale differences. This is a tiny proportion of research versus a massive body of research, but that the tiny proportion is the thing that does link it to everyday knowledge in life. And so it's an important role. And that's when it's well done, it comes from real need on both sides, like real understanding that we couldn't do this humanities research without understanding the scientific basis and the scientific understanding that you pointless, it's massive and it's data rich, but it's pointless to write this chapter unless you write something that is consumable, that is, comprehensible. So if it comes, even though it's like the 2 pages at the end of the 2 pages at the end of the 20 pages, it's still the one that probably most people will read. So I think it's sort of fine to see it as unbalanced, but not as unequal. Yeah.
I have a question online.
Speak.
Christy, would you mind unmuting yourself? I'm just going to put the volume up so that everyone can hear. Here we go. Please go
Can
first.
you hear me? I'm hoping you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I had a screen plugged in and calls earlier. No one could hear me. Thanks so much. It was super interesting talk. So I'm a deep sea scientist, so it's like very over my head. A lot of these like different ways of thinking and talking about things, and it's super interesting. I'm actually on One Ocean Hub, but as a scientist, a postdoc, and I just found it so interesting, like thinking even about the ways that we frame. I think as scientists, we always think about, oh, what's the environmental impact of this activity or whatever. And Alyssa Morgera, especially our director of One Ocean Hub, has kind of been talking about like the impact on human rights and human right to a healthy ocean, and just, I don't know, just framing things in a really different way. And I found it so interesting. But so I didn't really have a question, but just more to say, recently under a global program, we've launched something called the African Network of Deep Water Researchers, which is essentially like trying to bring together not necessarily only people who are active in deep sea research, because they're very few in Africa, but also people who are interested in it. And I guess like when I was super interested when I saw your talk, because so much of the deep water research that's happened in Africa has been done by non-Africans. Like the parachute science is a huge issue, obviously in shallower waters, but particularly in deep waters where like people just don't have access to vessels and don't have the expertise and all of that. Anyway, so part of what we're trying to do is to try and make some progress in advancing deep water research in South Africa. We're actually probably like the furthest along with this, but in other African nations. And we've had such a huge response of people who are interested in this. And we initially started out as like just ecology, because that was the kind of global program that this was launched under, as ecology, but then quickly found from the members that they wanted to be much more wide, because especially I think in countries you can have deep water research is so in the infancy, you can have like one ecologist, but then you have a geologist and a lawyer who's also working on it, and it's like about leaning on each other. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and I feel like I don't know, we should definitely chat further offline sometime or something, just to, because I think we are trying to kind of work out how we can advance deep water research in Africa. And part of that is like, how do we want to do that, recognizing that there are different ways of knowing. That's not all about measuring the pH of the water column or whatever it might be. And so it kind of, I guess, like casting the net a bit wider and working out what that means for us as African researchers. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you about it and see if it's something that you'd be interested in talking more about in the future. Yeah.
I mean, I'm totally going to recruit you in my web of relationality. So thank you, Kirsty. That's fantastic. And I'm always terrified to be talking in front of people that are working on the science. But two things that are important and which I'm so glad you've raised. And one is that, I mean, kind of in answer to your question, this attentiveness to histories of inequality and histories and a present of inequality is very important in an area where climate science and deep sea science are completely dominated by the nations that have the money. And, you know, that was the money from here. So, you know, that has to be brought, that kind of sense of social justice in relation to what's being done and therefore what might be overlooked and not considered. So the science, deep sea science was getting better, but it was quite like explorer, go out and smash up the undersea to find what's down there. And so how to bring up different relationalities of care is part of it. A sense of the history and the social justice is part of it. And then this, there just isn't, like this is like how to get on board in a joint project. And one of those ways is to generate interest. And the way that I'm thinking of my project is kind of like as a baseline survey, to use a scientific term, of what cultural engagements are out there already, that in which people are generating interest from across Africa and towards India, etc. Yeah.
Divide between the two disciplines. It's like it's not understandable. We have 100% of well, why do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge thing that has to be dealt with in interdisciplinary work, is this kind of divide between what people think of as those who can do science versus can do humanities, and it's often where you're good at maths at school. I mean, really, that's where the division begins, and there has to be some way of reducing the like just not thinking about it at all, which can be on the side of the humanities people, just like I'm not even going to go there. I remember some traumatic high school moments, and then that's me for life. I refuse to think about all science. But then also from the scientists, be like, well, your degree looks deceptively simple, and I think deceptively is the key word here. So that so then I value it less highly. Yeah, I mean, I do think. Yeah, I think that make lots of friends in different disciplines. Now that you're at university, this is your moment to do so. It'll stand you in good stead in the future. And I mean, I know scientists who are fantastic writers and poets who love maths. I just think because it's rare, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and you should be very proud of it, your capacity to do both. Yeah.
That's if I'm understanding you right, I think you're looking at the kind of setup. On the one hand, people use the scientific knowledge, bring authority peer-reviewed. The other side of the set. Communicators. And yeah, seems to be kind of odd solution. There. It seems to me that that is kind of all media movements. And that, you know, over the last 20 years, professional communication undermined. Yeah. And you know, in a way, social media, you could say it's democratized less and actually caused on the other hand, you can see that's the act of also undermining authority. And what's led me to this is thinking about the figurative notes. Somebody who becoming anti-vax, anti-science, really having entering the Trump as scientific method in which notes were really at some point clearly Tim was public figure, scientist, and then now in social media, all this happens. But without separation of power, all of that is not sustainable in an era when consensus of authority around science itself.
I mean, I hear your question, and that doesn't even bring in ChatGPT. So, which is like in kind of next level, both taking our jobs in science and in narrativization. But actually, both of these things are a danger to both of what, and I'm setting this up as a separation of powers, I kind of on purpose for the talk to say it's balanced, can be balanced in this way versus balanced in this way. And I'm actually not really talking about professional communicators like science journalists so much myself, because I work in the area of humanities research, which is slightly different. But I've seen kind of a social media burgeoning be a problem for both science and humanities, and be a tool for both science and humanities. So it's amazing how much of my research is supported by, the One Ocean Up people I follow on Instagram, and it's one way of keeping up to date. Actually, I know it's Twitter is hugely useful for up to date science papers. So I would say that in some ways, both that almost demonstrates the ways in which actually all of the academic disciplines and groupings, the science, the humanities, the arts, are actually on one side, really, of this debate, or of this divide, that really the separation of powers is on, the social media powers of evil, and the lower forms of knowledge, the more linked, peer-reviewed, and that's. I also don't want to exaggerate the difference. I think there's a lot of critical work to be done about the baseline assumptions of science, and there's a lot of ways in which humanities research does need to be held to the same standards. So that, what I've done here is kind of show them as a slightly exaggerated divide for the sake of trying to show some of the contrasts. But yeah, we're all at risk of, the bastardizations that are possible really because of the forces of capitalism more than, the tools of social media.
Okay, there's 10 minutes over time.
Yeah.
So if there are any other pressing questions, then so maybe grab Charne. I don't know if you're around for 5 minutes.
Can talk over cake.
Chat over cake. That's also fine. There's lots of cake to get through. But
sorry, everyone
are there
online.
any other pressing questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much, Charne.
Thank you.
may have noticed that we don't have simply one cake or even 2 cakes, we have 3 cakes. And that is both to celebrate our first colloquium of the year, but also it was Megan's birthday.
Oh,
We're also celebrating Megan's birthday with those cakes. So please eat lots of cake
Cakes on that.
and cakes on us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was really.